There is a particular quality of light on the British coastline in the early morning. It is a soft, gray light, the kind that does not arrive all at once but settles slowly, the way a blanket might be drawn across a sleeping figure by a quiet and unhurried hand. The sea on those mornings is dark and cold, the color of old pewter, and it moves in long, slow rhythms as though breathing. The cliffs stand very still above it, white or gray or brown depending on where you find yourself. And the wind, when it comes gently at first, carrying with it the smell of salt and wet stone and the faint, distant suggestion of somewhere else entirely. It is a useful thing to begin here, at the edge of the land, because it is here that the story of the British Empire really has its quietest and most ancient roots. Not in the courts of kings or the counting houses of merchants, though those places matter too, but here, at the water's edge, where the land simply stops and the ocean begins, and there is nothing to do but look outward and wonder what might lie beyond the horizon. That horizon on the British coast is never very far away. The islands that make up Britain are not large. You are never in Britain very far from the sea. And the sea, patient and ancient and vast, has always been present in the life of the people who have lived on those islands, pressing gently at their awareness, offering itself as both boundary and invitation. The earliest peoples of Britain knew the sea well. Long before there was anything we might recognize as England or Scotland or Wales, before there were kings or written languages or stone-built towns, there were people living along those coasts who understood the water, who built small boats from wood and animal hide and pushed them out into the gray, cold currents, following fish, following birds, following the slow pull of curiosity that seems to be one of the quieter but most persistent qualities of human nature. These were not voyages of empire, of course. They were something much simpler and much older. They were people moving through the world, finding their way by the stars and the feel of the wind and the color of the water beneath them, trusting the sea to carry them somewhere and then, eventually, carry them home again. The Romans, when they came to Britain in the 1st century before the Common Era, came by sea. Julius Caesar crossed the Channel twice, in 55 and 54 BCE, and his descriptions of the crossing have a quality of quiet observation to them that feels very familiar. The gray water, the white cliffs appearing slowly through the mist, the long, low coast that resolved itself gradually from the morning haze. The Romans found a land of forests and rivers and scattered settlements, a land that was wet and green and not entirely unlike the edges of other northern territories they had encountered, but also distinctly itself, island-shaped and sea-surrounded, with a quality of separateness that the Channel crossing seemed to underline. Britain was, in Roman understanding, the very edge of the known world. Beyond it lay only ocean, and beyond that nothing or nothing that could be named. The Romans stayed in Britain for nearly 4 centuries, and in that time they built roads and towns and walls and bathhouses, and they traded and administered and left behind them a very faint but persistent imprint on the landscape and the language. When they withdrew gradually through the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, they left behind a land that was in some ways changed, and in some ways exactly as it had always been: wet, green, island-shaped, surrounded by the same patient gray sea, still oriented in its deepest geography toward the water. What followed the Roman withdrawal was a long period of slow, quiet change. Various peoples moved across and into Britain from the continent: Angles and Saxons and Jutes, later Danes and Norsemen, and each of them came by sea. Each of them navigated those same gray channels and cold northern waters, and each of them brought with them a knowledge of boats and tides and ocean distances. The Vikings, in particular, were extraordinary sailors. Between roughly the 8th and 11th centuries, Norse and Danish seafarers ranged across an enormous portion of the known world in their long, shallow-drafted ships, navigating by the stars and the sun, and a kind of accumulated, inherited knowledge of the sea that had been passed down through generations. They reached Iceland and Greenland, and very likely the eastern coast of North America, centuries before any English ship would make that crossing. They settled in the north of Britain and along its coasts, and they left behind them, in the language and the place names and the ways of building boats, a trace of their extraordinary maritime confidence. This is worth noting, because when we speak of the origins of British seafaring, we are really speaking of a very long, very gradual accumulation of knowledge and habit and disposition, a slow layering, like the slow layering of sediment on a riverbed. There was no single moment when Britain became a maritime nation. It happened over centuries, quietly, through the work of countless unnamed people who built and sailed and repaired and rebuilt, who learned from one another and from the sea itself, who carried the knowledge forward in their hands and their memories, without ever writing it down or knowing that they were doing anything more than making a living and finding their way home. By the time of the Norman conquest in 1066, Britain was already deeply accustomed to the sea. The Normans themselves, whose name derives from the word Norsemen, were descended from those same Viking navigators, and they crossed the Channel with a fleet of several hundred ships, a logistical undertaking of considerable quiet complexity. William the Conqueror's invasion was, among other things, a maritime operation, dependent on winds and tides and the management of large numbers of boats across a stretch of water that could be, and often was, deeply uncooperative. That it succeeded, that the crossing was made, that the fleet held together, that the landing was managed, was in part a matter of fortune, and in part a matter of the accumulated nautical knowledge that the Normans carried with them from their Norse antecedents. The medieval period in Britain unfolded slowly, over many centuries, and the sea was always present in it. English and Welsh and Scottish fishermen worked the coastal waters and the banks of the North Sea and the North Atlantic, following the great seasonal migrations of herring and cod. English merchants traded across the Channel and along the coast of Europe, carrying wool and cloth and tin outward, bringing back wine and spice and fine goods from the south and east. The ports of Bristol and London and Southampton and Hull were busy, in the way that medieval ports were busy, not the breathless, clattering business of later centuries, but a quieter, rhythmic activity, the loading and unloading of ships, the mending of nets, the weighing of goods, the slow administrative work of customs and records. It was through this trade that England began, very gradually, to develop a more conscious awareness of the wider world. The goods that came into English ports, the spices and silks and dyes and fine metalwork, came from very far away, from the warm, distant lands of the East, carried overland along the ancient Silk Road or by sea through the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, and then overland again to the Mediterranean ports where Italian merchants purchased them and transported them northward. England was, in this system, at the end of a very long chain. The goods arrived having passed through many hands, each of which had added a little to the cost, so that by the time a sack of pepper or a bolt of silk reached a London merchant, it had become extraordinarily expensive, and the question of whether there might be a more direct route, a way of reaching the sources of these goods without the long chain of intermediaries, was one that occupied the minds of merchants and kings and scholars for much of the later medieval period. The 15th century was a time of slow, vast reorientation in European thought and practice. The Ottoman Empire, having consolidated its control over much of the eastern Mediterranean and the overland routes to Asia, had made the traditional paths of trade more difficult and more expensive. Portuguese navigators, working methodically and patiently along the coast of Africa, were developing new techniques of ocean sailing, new instruments, new methods of navigating by the stars, new designs of ship that could sail against the wind as well as with it. These developments were quiet and incremental, the work of many years and many voyages and many small improvements and corrections, but their cumulative effect was to make the open ocean, which had previously seemed like the edge of the world, into something more like a road, long and difficult and dangerous, certainly, but a road nonetheless, with destinations at the other end of it. England watched these Portuguese developments with a certain measured interest. The English crown was not, in the 15th century, in a position to mount large-scale ocean expeditions. The country had been exhausted by the long, grinding conflict of the Hundred Years' War with France, and then by the civil wars between the houses of York and Lancaster that we know as the Wars of the Roses. These were decades of domestic turbulence and expense, and the resources and attention of the crown were directed inward rather than outward. But the interest in distant trade did not disappear. It waited, as these things often do, patiently and quietly, for a more settled time. That more settled time arrived, gradually, with the Tudor dynasty. Henry VII, who came to the throne in 1485 and ended the Wars of the Roses, was a careful, methodical king, not given to dramatic gestures but deeply attentive to the commercial interests of his kingdom. It was Henry VII who, in 1496, issued letters patent to a Venetian navigator named Giovanni Caboto, known in English as John Cabot, authorizing him to sail westward under the English flag in search of lands unknown to Christian people. Cabot's voyage in 1497, in a small ship called the Matthew with a crew of 18 men, took him across the North Atlantic to the coast of what is now either Newfoundland or Nova Scotia. Historians still debate the precise landfall, and back again in a crossing of approximately 11 weeks. It was a quiet voyage in many ways. There was no gold found, no great populous empire encountered, no immediate commercial dividend. Cabot walked ashore, planted a cross and the flags of England and the Pope, noted that the seas nearby were full of fish, and sailed home. But something had been established. England had made a claim, however tentative and however little followed up at the time, upon a piece of the world that lay beyond the ocean. The letters patent that Henry issued are interesting documents to read, dry, careful, legal in their language, setting out the terms under which the Cabot family might explore and trade and govern any lands they might find. They speak of bringing such lands into the obedience of the English crown and of the revenues that might flow from such arrangements. There is nothing romantic about them. They are the language of administration and commerce, not of adventure. And perhaps that is fitting, because the British Empire, when it eventually came into being, would be very much an empire of administration and commerce. Patient, methodical, attentive to ledgers and maps and legal documents, built slowly over many generations by people who were, for the most part, not adventurers but merchants and clerks and governors and soldiers doing a job. The 16th century brought the Tudor state to its fullest expression under Henry VIII, and then, after the brief and complicated reigns of Edward VI and Mary I, under Elizabeth I, who ruled from 1558 to 1603. The Elizabethan period is the one most commonly associated with the beginnings of English maritime expansion, and there is good reason for this association, though the reality is more complicated and more gradual than the popular image suggests. The Elizabethan age was not a sudden flowering of maritime ambition. It was a continuation and acceleration of tendencies that had been present for generations, given particular energy and particular expression by the circumstances of the time. Those circumstances included, most importantly, the Reformation of the English Church under Henry VIII and its consolidation under Elizabeth, which had left England Protestant in a Europe that was bitterly divided between Protestantism and Catholicism. This religious division had profound commercial and geopolitical consequences. The great powers of the Catholic world, Spain and Portugal, had, by papal arrangement, divided the non-European world between them in the Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494, an arrangement that was entirely reasonable from their own perspective and entirely infuriating from the perspective of England and other Protestant nations who had been excluded from it. England's expansion overseas was, in part, a challenge to this arrangement, a quiet, persistent assertion that the world was larger than any pope's decree, and that the seas were open to those who could sail them. Elizabeth's reign saw a remarkable concentration of skilled navigators and ambitious merchants. Francis Drake completed the second circumnavigation of the globe between 1577 and 1580, sailing in the Golden Hind through the Strait of Magellan, up the Pacific coast of South America, across the Pacific, through the Indian Ocean, and back around the Cape of Good Hope, a voyage of almost 3 years, covering approximately 36,000 miles of ocean. Drake's voyage was, in its way, a profoundly practical undertaking. He was raiding Spanish shipping and ports as much as he was exploring, and the wealth he brought back to England, much of it acquired from Spanish vessels in the Pacific, was considerable. Elizabeth, who had privately invested in the voyage, received a very satisfactory return. But beyond its immediate financial value, Drake's circumnavigation demonstrated something important: that English sailors could navigate the most difficult waters in the world, could manage long ocean passages without the assistance of Spanish or Portuguese charts or harbors, could find their way around the globe using the accumulated knowledge of the sea that the English maritime tradition had been quietly building for centuries. Martin Frobisher made 3 voyages between 1576 and 1578 in search of a northwest passage, a route around the top of North America that might lead to the Spice Islands of Asia. He did not find it. The waters of the Canadian Arctic, which Frobisher entered carefully and mapped partially, were cold and difficult and ultimately impenetrable to the ships of his time. But he brought back from his second voyage a large quantity of black rock that he and others believed to contain gold and silver. It did not. The rock was iron pyrite and hornblende, and the elaborate smelting operations that were organized in England to process it produced nothing of value. It is a quiet, instructive story, the optimism of the enterprise meeting the patient indifference of the physical world. Frobisher's voyages produced no immediate commercial dividend, but they added to the accumulating body of knowledge about the North Atlantic, and they demonstrated that the English were willing to push into difficult and unknown waters in pursuit of what they imagined might be waiting there. Humphrey Gilbert, the half-brother of Walter Raleigh, had a long-standing interest in the theoretical possibility of a Northwest Passage, and he wrote about it at length in a pamphlet published in 1576. Gilbert's broader vision was of English colonies established in the New World, permanent settlements of English people who would live and work and trade in territories claimed by the English crown. In 1583, he sailed to Newfoundland and formally claimed it for England, walking ashore at what is now St. John's Harbor and reading the letters patent aloud to the assembled fishermen, many of them from various nations, who were already using the harbor as a seasonal base. The formality of the claim was very English in its character, the careful reading of a legal document, the assertion of sovereignty through the proper forms of procedure. Gilbert's colony did not survive. He was lost at sea on the return voyage, and the settlement he had envisioned never materialized. But the claim had been made, and the idea of English colonies in the New World had been, as it were, formally articulated. Walter Raleigh, inheriting his brother's patent, organized 2 expeditions to the coast of what is now North Carolina in 1584 and 1585, and it was Raleigh who gave the territory the name Virginia, in honor of the unmarried queen. The colonists of the 1585 expedition, who spent about a year on Roanoke Island before returning to England, brought back with them 2 things that would quietly alter English life: tobacco and the potato. Both plants had been known to Spanish explorers for some time, but their introduction into England through the Roanoke connection helped establish them in the English imagination, and eventually, in English fields and English habits. A later attempt at Roanoke in 1587 produced the famous mystery of the lost colony, a group of settlers who, when a resupply ship finally reached them in 1590 after a 3-year delay caused by the Spanish Armada crisis, had vanished entirely, leaving only the word Croatan carved on a post. What happened to them is not known, and will likely never be known. They drifted out of history quietly, leaving only that single carved word behind. The Spanish Armada of 1588 is often presented as a dramatic turning point, but it is perhaps more useful to think of it as one moment in a much longer, slower process of adjustment between European powers. Philip II of Spain had assembled a large fleet, 130 ships, with the intention of ferrying a Spanish army from the Netherlands to England, overthrowing Elizabeth, and restoring the country to Catholicism. The fleet was met by English ships in the Channel and harried northward, and then scattered by a storm in the North Sea, and many of the surviving ships were wrecked on the coasts of Scotland and Ireland on the long way home. The English victory was real, but it was not complete, and Spanish sea power was not destroyed. England would continue to face Spanish competition on the seas for decades. But the Armada's failure did establish something important in the English imagination, a sense that the sea was, in some deep way, England's element, that the island nation was protected by its surrounding waters, and more than that, empowered by them. It is a useful place to pause. At the end of Elizabeth's reign, in 1603, England had made only the most tentative beginnings of what would eventually become the largest empire in history. There were no permanent English colonies anywhere in the world. The trade in spices and silks and other Asian goods was still largely in the hands of Portuguese and Dutch merchants. The vast territories of North America, Asia, Africa, and the Pacific were known to English navigators only in the most partial and fragmentary way. And yet something had been established, a disposition, a habit of mind, a set of skills and institutions and commercial relationships that pointed outward, toward the horizon, toward the vast and patient ocean that surrounded the island on all its sides. The ships were being built. The charts were being drawn. The merchants were forming their companies and their partnerships. The slow, gradual process of outward movement had begun, like a tide that has turned without anyone quite noticing, pulling gently and persistently in a new direction. The light on the British coast in the early morning is still that same soft gray. The sea still moves in its long, slow rhythms. The cliffs still stand above it, patient and still. And if you stand there long enough, watching the horizon, you begin to understand something of what those early navigators must have felt. Not excitement, not ambition exactly, but something quieter and more persistent. A kind of wondering attention directed at the distant line where the gray sea meets the gray sky, where the known world ends and the vast, unhurried unknown begins. The island looked outward. Slowly, gradually, over many centuries and many quiet generations of sailors and merchants and clerks and dreamers, it began to move in the direction of its gaze. What it found there, and what it made of what it found, is the story that will unfold across the chapters that follow, drifting forward, unhurried, through time. There is a particular kind of map that was made in the 18th and 19th centuries, the kind you sometimes find reproduced in old atlases or framed in the corridors of certain quiet institutional buildings, schools, libraries, the offices of learned societies. On these maps, the world is laid out in its familiar shapes, the continents arranged across the flattened globe in the way that has become so habitual to the eye that it is easy to forget how much careful work went into their making. And on these maps, scattered across the oceans and the continents in varying concentrations and densities, there are patches of a particular color. Red, not a bright or aggressive red, but a soft, faded red, the color of old brick or dried roses or the light that comes through curtains in a late afternoon room. That color, spread across the map like something spilled very slowly and very long ago and never quite cleaned up, marks the territories of the British Empire. It is worth sitting with that image for a moment. The slow spread of the color, the way it appears here and there across the map, on coastlines and islands and river valleys and mountain ranges, in places that share almost nothing in their climate or their landscape or their people except for the presence of that soft, faded red. The spread was not planned, not in any single coherent sense. It happened over more than 3 centuries, accumulating through thousands of individual decisions and accidents and negotiations and conflicts, each one small and local in its own moment, each one adding a little more color to the map. It is a useful thing to remember that the map came after the territory, that the red was not laid down all at once, according to a plan, but built up gradually, like layers of paint applied over many years by many different hands. The 17th century was the century in which the slow spread of red truly began. James I, who succeeded Elizabeth in 1603 and united the crowns of England and Scotland in his person, though not yet in law, inherited a country that was increasingly interested in trade and increasingly convinced that permanent overseas settlements were the proper vehicle for that trade. The great trading companies that had been established in the late Elizabethan period, the East India Company, founded in 1600, the most consequential of them, were beginning to find their feet, sending ships out and receiving ships back, building up the patient, meticulous networks of credit and correspondence and commercial relationship that would eventually sustain an empire. And the question of American settlement, which had been hovering in the English imagination since Raleigh's Roanoke ventures, was beginning to move toward an answer. The first permanent English settlement in North America was established at Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607. Three ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, had left England in December 1606 and arrived on the coast of Virginia in late April 1607, carrying 104 settlers who came ashore and began the slow, difficult work of building a colony on a marshy peninsula in the James River. Jamestown's early years were extremely hard. The settlers faced disease and hunger and difficult relations with the local Powhatan people, and many of them died. Through the winter of 1609 to 1610, known as the Starving Time, the settlement was reduced from perhaps 500 people to 60. There were moments when the colony came very close to being abandoned entirely, but it was not abandoned. It persisted, through a combination of stubbornness and resupply and gradual accommodation with its environment, and it survived into something more stable, more permanent, more recognizably colonial in the way that word would come to be understood. What saved Jamestown economically was tobacco. John Rolfe, who is also remembered for his marriage to Pocahontas, the daughter of the Powhatan chief, began experimenting with tobacco cultivation in the colony around 1612, using seeds from the milder-flavored Spanish variety rather than the harsher native kind, and by 1614 he was shipping cured tobacco back to England. The demand for tobacco in England was already well established, and it was growing. The colony's planters took to tobacco cultivation with great energy, planting it everywhere in the streets, in the cemeteries, in any piece of ground that could be made to yield it. By 1617, the colony was exporting about 2,000 pounds of tobacco a year. By 1629, it was exporting 1.5 million pounds. Tobacco transformed Virginia from a struggling experiment into a commercially viable operation, and in doing so it established a pattern that would repeat itself across the empire in different forms and different commodities. The pattern of a colonial territory producing, at large scale, a single crop for export to the metropolitan market, a pattern with profound consequences for land, labor, and human life that would take centuries to fully understand. The tobacco economy of Virginia required land and it required labor, and the ways in which those requirements were met shaped the colony and, eventually, shaped a great deal more than the colony. Land was taken, gradually and then less gradually, from the indigenous peoples who had lived on it for thousands of years. The Powhatan Confederacy, which had initially maintained a complex and somewhat cautious relationship with the English settlers, found itself under increasing pressure as the tobacco planters' appetite for land expanded outward from the original settlement. Conflicts escalated through the 17th century. The Powhatan attacks of 1622 and 1644, and the English retaliations that followed them, and the effect, over time, was the displacement of the indigenous population from the lands along the James River and its tributaries, a displacement that was gradual and persistent and deeply consequential, unfolding over decades with the patient weight of demography and disease and organized force pressing in one direction. Labor came, in the first decades of the Virginia colony, primarily from England itself, from the tens of thousands of men and women who came as indentured servants, binding themselves to work for a planter for a fixed term of years, usually 4 to 7, in exchange for their passage across the Atlantic, and at the end of their term, a small allocation of land and goods. The system of indentured servitude was not easy. The work was hard and the conditions were often harsh, and the mortality rate in the early decades of the colony was very high. But it brought people, and it brought labor, and it worked after a fashion for the first half of the 17th century. Gradually, however, the planters began to supplement and then to replace indentured servants with enslaved Africans. The first Africans to arrive in Virginia came in 1619, when an English privateer brought a group of captive Africans who had been taken from a Portuguese slave ship. The legal status of these first Africans in Virginia was ambiguous. Some of them achieved freedom and even land ownership in the course of the following decades. But as the century progressed, the legal framework of chattel slavery, in which Africans and their descendants were defined as property rather than persons, was built up slowly and methodically through a series of colonial laws and court decisions. Until by the 1660s and 1670s, it was firmly established as the foundation of the Virginian labor system. This is the weight that sits at the heart of the story of the empire's spread, not dramatic, not sudden, but patient and systematic and immense in its human cost. The slave trade that would eventually carry somewhere between 10 and 12 million Africans across the Atlantic was not a single policy decided in a single room on a single day. It was built up gradually, like the empire itself, through thousands of individual decisions made by merchants and planters and ship captains and legislators, each one operating within the logic of the system as they found it, each one adding a little to the weight. While Virginia was establishing itself on the Tobacco Coast, other English settlements were taking shape further north. In 1620, a group of religious separatists, the Pilgrim Fathers, as they would later be called, sailed from Plymouth in a small ship called the Mayflower and established a settlement at what is now Plymouth, Massachusetts, after a crossing of 66 days. The Pilgrims were followed by larger waves of Puritan settlers in the 1630s, the so-called Great Migration, which brought perhaps 20,000 people to New England between 1630 and 1640. These settlers were driven by religious conviction as much as by commercial motive. They were seeking a place where they could practice their form of Protestant Christianity free from the pressures of the English Church. They built towns and farms and churches across the cold, rocky landscape of New England, and they established institutions, town meetings, congregational churches, schools and colleges that reflected their own particular ideas about community and governance. The New England settlements had a different character from the tobacco colonies to the south. They were smaller in scale, more densely settled, more oriented toward mixed farming and fishing and small-scale trade than toward the production of a single export crop. They had no need for large quantities of unfree labor in the way that the tobacco planters did. Their relationship with the indigenous peoples of the region was different too, though not ultimately less destructive. The wars of the 1670s, particularly King Philip's War of 1675 to 1676, were among the most devastating conflicts, proportionally, in North American history, and they resulted in the near destruction of the indigenous communities of southern New England. But the texture of the New England colonies was distinct, and it would remain distinct through the colonial period and beyond, shaping the particular quality of American life in ways that are still faintly visible. Meanwhile, far to the south and east, the East India Company was pursuing a very different kind of colonial project. The company had been founded in 1600, with a charter granting it a monopoly on English trade with the East Indies, a term that encompassed, vaguely, everything east of the Cape of Good Hope. Its early voyages were focused on the Spice Islands of what is now Indonesia, where the Portuguese and then the Dutch had established their trading presence. But the company found itself gradually pushed out of the most lucrative spice trade by Dutch competition, and it turned instead toward India, where the great Mughal Empire, one of the largest and wealthiest states in the world, offered commercial possibilities of a different kind. The company established its first trading post, called a factory, at Surat on the western coast of India in 1613, having obtained permission from the Mughal Emperor Jahangir after an embassy conducted by Sir Thomas Roe. This was a very different kind of relationship from the one the English settlers were establishing in Virginia or New England. In India, the company was not planting settlers or claiming land. It was seeking permission to trade, asking, in a formal and respectful way, for the right to establish a commercial presence within the territories of a powerful and sophisticated empire. The Mughal court received the English embassy with courtesy and a certain measured condescension, as it received all foreign embassies, and it granted trading rights in exchange for English goods, particularly English woolens, though the market for these in the warm Indian climate was limited, and more usefully, English naval assistance in keeping the sea lanes free of Portuguese interference. The early decades of the company in India were genuinely commercial in their character. The company's servants, the word is telling, though their actual status was considerably more complex, lived and worked in their factories, conducting the patient daily business of trade, buying and selling, keeping accounts, maintaining correspondence with London and with other factories along the coast. They bought cotton textiles, which were produced in enormous variety and quality across the Indian subcontinent, and indigo and saltpeter, used in the making of gunpowder, and later silk and pepper and other spices. They sent these goods back to England on the company's ships, the great East Indiamen that were the largest and most elaborately constructed merchant vessels of their time, capable of the long ocean passage around the Cape of Good Hope and carrying substantial cargoes in their deep holds. It was a world of paperwork and patience. The company's archives, which survive in substantial quantity in the British Library in London, are filled with the slow, careful accumulation of commercial correspondence, letters from factors in Surat and Masuliputam and Madras reporting on the state of the markets, the quality of the available cloth, the prices being offered by competing Dutch and Portuguese merchants, the political conditions in the territories where they were operating. The letters travel slowly, carried by the ships that took months to complete the passage from India to England and back, so that news and instructions were always out of date by the time they arrived, and the men on the ground were required to use their own judgment in a way that would shape the company's culture of autonomous, locally empowered decision-making for generations. In the Caribbean, the slow spread of red was taking a different form again. English settlers had established themselves on St. Kitts in 1623 and on Barbados in 1627, and through the following decades, they turned to the cultivation of sugar, a crop that had been developed in Brazil by Portuguese planters using African enslaved labor, and which found the climate and soil of the Caribbean islands ideally suited to its requirements. Sugar was an extraordinarily profitable crop, and it transformed the Caribbean economy and the Caribbean landscape with a thoroughness that is still visible. The forests were cleared, the land was prepared, and the great sugar estates spread across the hillsides and the valleys, worked by enslaved Africans brought across the Atlantic in the holds of ships in conditions of extreme suffering. By the later 17th century, the English Caribbean islands, Barbados, Jamaica, taken from Spain in 1655, the Leeward Islands were producing sugar in enormous quantities for the English and European markets, and the wealth generated by this production was flowing back to England in a steady, patient stream that enriched merchants and planters and investors, and through them, the broader English economy. The capture of Jamaica in 1655 is worth noting as an example of how the empire's spread often happened not according to plan, but through opportunism and adjustment. Oliver Cromwell, who was running England at the time as Lord Protector after the execution of Charles I, had sent an expedition to the Caribbean with the intention of capturing Hispaniola, the large and wealthy Spanish island. The attack on Hispaniola failed. The expedition's commanders, unwilling to return to England empty-handed, turned instead to the smaller and less defended island of Jamaica and took it, more or less by default. Cromwell was disappointed. He had wanted the larger prize, but Jamaica proved in time to be enormously valuable, becoming the most productive sugar island in the British Caribbean and remaining a British territory for more than 3 centuries. The restoration of Charles II in 1660 brought a new energy to English commercial and colonial ambition. Charles was a sophisticated and cosmopolitan king, deeply interested in trade and science and the possibilities of the wider world, and his reign saw a significant expansion of English overseas activity. The Navigation Acts, which required that goods traded to and from English colonies be carried in English ships, were refined and extended during this period, building up the framework of mercantilist economic policy that would govern colonial trade for the next century and a half. New colonies were established or consolidated. The Carolinas, the proprietary colony of Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn in 1681 as a refuge for Quakers and other religious minorities. New York, which the Dutch had established as New Amsterdam, was taken by an English fleet in 1664 and renamed in honor of the king's brother, the Duke of York. The Dutch, who had been England's principal commercial rivals throughout the mid-17th century, were gradually displaced from their dominant position in Asian trade through a combination of military conflict and commercial competition. 3 Anglo-Dutch Wars, in 1652 to 1654, 1665 to 1667, and 1672 to 1674, settled, imperfectly, the question of commercial supremacy in the North Sea and the English Channel, and though the Dutch retained their position in the East Indies spice trade, the English East India Company was consolidating its position in India and beginning to extend its commercial reach along the Indian coast and inland. The company acquired Bombay in 1668, when Charles II transferred it to the company at a nominal rent. It had come to the English crown as part of the dowry of Catherine of Braganza, Charles's Portuguese wife, and Bombay's deep natural harbor would become, over the following centuries, one of the most important commercial and naval centers in the Indian Ocean world. Through all of this, the pace of change was slow. A lifetime spent in the service of the East India Company in the 17th century was a lifetime of patient, methodical commercial work, of keeping accounts and writing letters and negotiating with local merchants and officials, and managing the slow, careful business of loading and unloading ships. A lifetime spent as a planter in Virginia or Barbados was a lifetime of agricultural management, of watching the seasons and the crops, of dealing with the human beings whose labor made the whole enterprise possible. The empire was not experienced, by most of the people within it, as something grand or historical. It was experienced as work, as commerce, as the daily reality of life in a particular place. The grandeur was something added later, looking back. But the color was spreading across the map, slowly and persistently, in its soft and faded red. The coastlines of North America were acquiring their English names and their English institutions. The Caribbean islands were being remade in the image of the sugar economy. The ports of India were receiving English factors and English ships. And the East India Company, in its counting houses in London and its factories along the Indian coast, was accumulating the wealth and the experience and the institutional knowledge that would eventually carry it far beyond its original commercial purpose, into territories and ambitions that its founders could not have imagined. There is something almost geological about the pace of it. The empire did not rise like a wave. It accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer, year upon year, each layer thin and seemingly insignificant in itself, but the whole, over time, becoming something of considerable thickness and weight. The red on the map spread like water finding its level, following the lines of least resistance, pooling in the harbors and the river valleys and the fertile coastal plains, and then, gradually, beginning to move inland. The ships came and went, loaded and unloaded, crossed and recrossed the great oceans. The letters were written and read and replied to months later. The accounts were kept. The crops were grown and harvested and shipped. The colonies grew slowly, adding people and buildings and fields and roads, acquiring the patient solidity of things that have been in one place for a long time. And the map, updated periodically by the cartographers who tried to keep pace with the accumulating reality, filled in with more and more of that soft, faded, quietly persistent red. The light at the end of the 17th century, falling on an English port like Bristol or London, fell on something that was already different from what it had been at the century's beginning, richer, more connected, more aware of the width of the world, more accustomed to the daily presence of goods and people and ideas from very far away. The sugar in the coffee, the tobacco in the pipe, the cotton in the cloth, these things were already beginning to stitch the empire's distant territories into the fabric of ordinary English life, so gently and so gradually that it was almost possible not to notice, almost possible to take it for granted, almost possible to forget that behind each of these ordinary, comfortable things there lay an ocean crossing, a plantation, a ledger, and always the slow, persistent, accumulating weight of other people's labor. The spread continued, unhurried into the next century. There is a kind of building that appears, in various forms and with various degrees of architectural ambition, in almost every territory that was once part of the British Empire. It is usually made of brick or stone, sometimes whitewashed, sometimes left in its natural color, which tends toward a warm ochre or a pale gray depending on the local geology. It has wide verandas on its upper floors, designed to catch whatever breeze might move through the heavy air. It has tall windows with shutters, and high ceilings inside to allow the heat to rise away from the people working below. There is almost always a flagpole somewhere nearby, and a set of broad stone steps leading up to a heavy front door, and inside there are rooms furnished with desks and filing cabinets and shelves of leather-bound ledgers and stacked folders of correspondence tied with faded ribbon. The building smells of paper and ink and, faintly, of the particular climate in which it sits, the damp warmth of the tropics, or the dry heat of the plains, or the salt-tinged air of a coastal town. It is a government building. It is an administrative office. It is, in miniature, the empire made physical, the empire as a system of rooms and desks and files, as an enormous, patient, endlessly self-documenting bureaucratic enterprise. The 18th and 19th centuries were, in the deepest sense, the administrative centuries of the British Empire. This was the period in which the empire reached its greatest territorial extent, in which the mechanisms of colonial governance were developed and refined and exported to the furthest corners of the world, in which the vast apparatus of record-keeping and correspondence and legal codification that held the empire together was built up, piece by piece, into something of remarkable complexity and remarkable durability. It was an age of maps and telegrams, of governors and district officers, of courts and customs houses and census records and railway timetables. It was, in its way, a very quiet age, not without conflict, not without suffering, not without the constant, grinding friction of one civilization pressing itself upon many others, but quiet in the sense that most of its work was done in offices, in writing, in the slow, methodical accumulation of information and instruction and response. To understand the administrative empire, it helps to begin with the instrument through which so much of it was managed, the letter. Before the telegraph, before the railway, before any of the technologies that would later accelerate the pace of communication to something approaching the immediate, the empire ran on letters. Letters written in London and received in Calcutta or Cape Town or Kingston 6 weeks or 3 months later. Letters written in reply and received back in London after another 6 weeks or 3 months. The round trip of a piece of correspondence between London and India might take 6 months or more, which meant that the people on the ground, the governor, the district collector, the factor at the trading post, were always operating with instructions that were already outdated, always using their own judgment to fill in the gaps between what London had told them to do and what the present situation actually required. This necessity of local judgment had profound consequences for the character of colonial administration. The men who ran the empire's distant territories, and they were almost exclusively men in this period, needed to be capable of independent decision-making in ways that their counterparts in domestic government did not. They were required to make decisions about law, about taxation, about the management of land and labor and local politics, often in circumstances that no one in London had anticipated and for which no instructions had been provided. The culture of the empire's administrative class was shaped by this requirement. It valued a certain kind of practical self-reliance, a capacity for calm and deliberate action under pressure, a willingness to act and then to write a full account of one's actions and reasoning in the letter that would eventually make its way back to London, months later, to be read and approved or questioned by the relevant authority. The relevant authority, for much of the 18th century, was the East India Company. The company's court of directors in London exercised a supervisory function over the company's operations in India, sending out instructions and receiving back the long, detailed dispatches, sometimes running to hundreds of pages, in which the presidencies of Bengal, Bombay, and Madras reported on the state of their territories and the decisions they had taken. The relationship between the directors in London and the governors in India was not always smooth. The governors, immersed in the immediate realities of Indian politics and the pressing demands of the company's commercial and military interests, sometimes took actions that alarmed or puzzled the directors. The directors, reading these accounts in their comfortable offices in Leadenhall Street in London, sometimes sent back instructions that were inappropriate or impractical given conditions on the ground. The empire ran, in this sense, on a kind of permanent, gentle tension between the center and the periphery, between the authority that issued instructions and the authority that had to carry them out in conditions the center could only dimly imagine. The transformation of the East India Company from a trading organization into something very like a territorial government happened slowly, across the 18th century, through a series of events that were not planned and not entirely desired by the company itself. The decline of the Mughal Empire, which had been the dominant political power in India since the early 16th century, accelerated after the death of the Emperor Aurangzeb in 1707. The great centralized state that the Mughals had built began to fragment, and in the political vacuum that followed, various regional powers, the Marathas, the Nawabs of Bengal and Hyderabad and Awadh, the rulers of Mysore, expanded their authority and competed with one another, and with the European trading companies that had established themselves along the coasts. The company, which had always maintained small military forces for the protection of its trading posts, found itself drawn increasingly into the conflicts of Indian politics, offering military assistance to one party or another in exchange for commercial concessions, and gradually accumulating political influence and territorial control as a byproduct of its commercial operations. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 is often cited as the moment at which the company's transformation from trader to ruler became irreversible. Robert Clive, commanding a force of company soldiers and Indian sepoys, defeated the Nawab of Bengal, Suraj-ud-Dawla, at a mango grove on the bank of the Bhagirathi River on a June morning. The battle itself was not large. The Nawab's army was much bigger than Clive's force, but much of it stood still during the fighting, its commanders having already been bribed to withhold their support. The outcome was the effective installation of a new Nawab, Mir Jafar, who was indebted to the company, and who granted it extensive commercial privileges and a large payment of money as the price of its support. The company's position in Bengal was transformed overnight from that of a commercial operator to that of a political power with military force at its disposal, and a client ruler dependent on its favor. What followed over the next several decades was the gradual formalization of this new reality. The company acquired the Diwani, the right to collect land revenue from Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa in 1765, which meant that it was now, in effect, the fiscal administrator of a territory containing tens of millions of people. The practical implications of this were enormous and, in the short term, deeply damaging. The company's servants, not yet experienced in the administration of land revenue, and not entirely scrupulous in their personal conduct, extracted money from Bengal with a thoroughness that contributed to the catastrophic famine of 1769 to 1770. In which perhaps a third of the population of Bengal died. The famine was a quiet disaster, not a dramatic, sudden catastrophe, but a slow, grinding, months-long deterioration of food supply and human life, unfolding across a landscape of rice fields and river deltas, invisible to anyone who was not in the middle of it, known in England only through the numbers in the company's reports, and the occasional, troubling letter from a servant who had seen something of what was happening. The famine shocked opinion in England, and contributed to a growing sense that the company's governance of India needed to be brought under some degree of public oversight. The Regulating Act of 1773 established a Governor-General of Bengal with authority over the other presidencies, and created a Supreme Court in Calcutta. Pitt's India Act of 1784 went further, establishing a board of control in London with authority to supervise the company's political and military activities, while leaving its commercial operations in the company's own hands. These were the first steps in a long, slow process of bringing the empire's governance within the framework of British public law and constitutional practice, a process that would continue, in various forms, for the next century and beyond. The Governor-Generalship of Warren Hastings, who held the position from 1772 to 1785, illustrates something of the complexity and the texture of imperial administration in this early phase. Hastings was a remarkable administrator, patient, intelligent, deeply interested in Indian languages and culture and history, committed to the idea that the company's governance of India should be conducted, as far as possible, in accordance with Indian legal and cultural traditions, rather than in simple imposition of English forms. He established institutions for the study of Indian law and literature. He commissioned translations of Sanskrit texts. He sought to understand the country he was governing on its own terms, as well as on the company's. His administration was also marked by difficult decisions, military campaigns against Mysore, and the Marathas' financial exactions that made enemies. And he was, on his return to England, impeached by Parliament in a trial that lasted 7 years and ended in acquittal. The impeachment, managed largely by Edmund Burke, who felt passionately that the company's governance of India had been abusive and unjust, was itself a kind of administrative event. A long, slow, paper-heavy reckoning conducted through the forms of parliamentary procedure, full of speeches and documents and legal arguments, grinding forward over years toward its ultimately inconclusive end. The great age of Indian administration proper began, perhaps, with the Governor-Generalship of Lord Cornwallis, who served from 1786 to 1793, and introduced a series of reforms that shaped Indian colonial governance for generations. Cornwallis established the permanent settlement of Bengal in 1793, which fixed the land revenue obligations of the zamindars, the landholders, at a permanent rate, and gave them secure property rights in exchange. The intention was to create a class of improving landlords along English lines, men with a stake in the land who would invest in its productivity and provide a stable base for revenue collection. The actual effects were more complicated. The permanent settlement enriched some zamindars and ruined others, and it left the cultivating peasantry in a condition of considerable vulnerability. But it established the principle that the colonial state would govern through the mediation of local social structures, working with and through existing hierarchies rather than replacing them entirely. Cornwallis also reformed the company's civil service, establishing higher salaries for company servants and strictly separating their official functions from any private trading activities. The purpose was to reduce corruption and to create a more professional administrative cadre, men who owed their position and their livelihood to the company, and to their performance of its administrative functions rather than to their personal commercial activities. This reform was the beginning of the long process by which the Indian civil service, the great administrative machine of the British Raj, was developed into one of the most elaborately organized bureaucracies in the history of the world. The Indian civil service in its mature form, as it existed from the mid-19th century onward, was an extraordinary institution. Entry was by competitive examination, introduced in 1853, and the examination was deliberately designed to be difficult, to require not specialist knowledge of India or administration, but a broad and deep classical education of the kind provided by the great English public schools and the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. The men who passed the examination, and it was, again, almost exclusively men, were trained in Indian languages and law before being sent out to the subcontinent, where they would spend their careers managing the daily administration of districts containing hundreds of thousands of people, presiding over courts and collecting revenue and settling disputes and managing famines, and generally functioning as the local embodiment of the colonial state. The district officer was the fundamental unit of the British administrative system in India. A young man, typically in his early 20s, arriving in his first posting, might find himself responsible for a district the size of an English county, containing a population of perhaps 500,000 people, with a small staff of Indian clerks and assistants, and a set of offices filled with the accumulated records of previous administrations going back decades. His working day was long and varied, hearing cases in court in the morning, reviewing revenue accounts in the afternoon, riding out to inspect a road or a well or a market in the late afternoon when the heat began to ease, writing up his notes and correspondence in the evening by lamplight. He lived in most postings in a bungalow, a word borrowed from the Bengali Bangla, meaning a low house with a wide veranda, surrounded by the particular landscape of his district, which might be the flat, watery plains of Bengal or the dry uplands of the Deccan or the forested hills of the northeast, and which became, over the years of his posting, deeply familiar to him in the way that a landscape becomes familiar when you move through it every day in all weathers and all seasons. The files accumulated, the records grew. In the great provincial capitals, Calcutta, Bombay, Madras, Lahore, Allahabad, the secretariats filled with the paper products of colonial administration, millions upon millions of documents recording the daily transactions of governance, revenue assessments and court judgments and public works proposals and census returns and correspondence between departments and between levels of the hierarchy. The census itself was a significant administrative undertaking. The first comprehensive census of British India was conducted in 1871 to 1872, and it required the mobilization of an enormous network of enumerators who fanned out across the subcontinent, counting and categorizing the population according to a set of categories: caste, religion, occupation, language, that were not always well suited to the complex realities of Indian social life, but that reflected the administrative need to know, to count, to organize the world into manageable and legible categories. The telegraph, which arrived in India in the 1850s, transformed the administrative world in ways that were both practical and symbolic. For the first time, it was possible to communicate with London not in weeks or months, but in hours. A message sent from Calcutta could be received in London the same day. The implications for the management of the empire were enormous. The gap between instruction and action, which had shaped the culture of imperial administration for 2.5 centuries, began to close. London could now know, almost immediately, what was happening in India, and could send instructions back almost as quickly. The latitude that distance had previously granted to governors and district officers narrowed. The center drew closer to the periphery. The empire became, in a sense, smaller, more tightly connected, more directly managed, more susceptible to the kind of centralized oversight that the physical limitations of letter writing had previously made impossible. The railway was the other great transforming technology of the high Victorian Empire. The first railway in India opened in 1853, running from Bombay to Thane, a distance of about 21 miles. Within 30 years, India had one of the largest railway networks in the world, with thousands of miles of track crossing the subcontinent and connecting the ports and the provincial capitals, and the inland cities and the grain markets, and the military cantonments in a web of iron and steam that fundamentally altered the geography of the country. The railways were built for a mixture of commercial, administrative, and military reasons: to move goods to the ports, to move troops to areas of unrest, to open up the interior to trade and to the presence of the colonial state. They were built largely by Indian labor, at significant human cost in the difficult conditions of construction, and they were financed partly by a guarantee arrangement through which the British government guaranteed returns to railway investors, a system that transferred financial risk to Indian taxpayers while delivering profits to British shareholders. In other parts of the empire, the administrative apparatus took different forms but shared the same fundamental character: the patient accumulation of information, the systematic codification of local practice into colonial law, the development of institutions through which the colonial state could make itself felt in the daily lives of the people it governed. In West Africa, in the late 19th century, a system of indirect rule was developed, most fully articulated by Frederick Lugard in Nigeria, through which the colonial administration governed through existing African political structures, the emirs and chiefs and kings, rather than by direct administration. The principle was practical as much as philosophical. There were never enough British officials to administer African territories directly, and governing through local authorities was cheaper and, in the short term, less disruptive. But indirect rule also reflected a particular administrative philosophy, a belief that colonial governance should work with the grain of local society rather than against it, preserving existing institutions while gradually orienting them toward the purposes of the colonial state. In Australia, which had been settled by the British as a penal colony beginning in 1788, the administrative story was different again. The transportation of convicts to New South Wales, the first fleet of 11 ships carrying about 1,500 people, of whom roughly half were convicts, arrived at Botany Bay in January 1788, and then moved on to the more suitable harbor of Port Jackson, where the settlement of Sydney was established, was itself a kind of administrative solution to a problem created by the loss of the American colonies, which had previously received transported criminals. Australia's development from penal colony to free settlement to self-governing dominion was a slow, decades-long process, marked by the gradual increase in free settlers and the gradual relaxation of the penal administration, and culminating in the granting of responsible government to the various Australian colonies in the 1850s, and their federation as the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901. Canada had followed a similar, if earlier, path. The British North America Act of 1867 created the Dominion of Canada, bringing together the provinces of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia in a federal union with responsible government. Canada was the first of what would become the Dominions, those territories of largely British settlement that were granted effective self-government while remaining within the empire and acknowledging the sovereignty of the British crown. The Dominion model represented a particular kind of administrative solution to the question of how to hold together an empire of enormous territorial extent and enormous internal diversity, not by direct rule from London, but by a looser arrangement of shared sovereignty and common institutions, in which the local governments managed their own affairs, while the imperial connection was maintained through ties of trade and law and sentiment, and the person of the monarch. And so the administrative empire at its height in the later Victorian period was not a single thing but a vast and complex arrangement of different types of governance, different institutional forms, different relationships between the center and the periphery. India was governed by the crown after the transfer of power from the East India Company in 1858 through a viceroy in Calcutta and a secretary of state in London. The dominions governed themselves. The crown colonies were administered by governors appointed from London. The protectorates were managed through their existing rulers. The whole arrangement was held together not by a single administrative principle, but by a family of overlapping principles, maintained in practice by the slow, patient, daily work of the men and women who populated its offices and its courts and its district headquarters, writing their letters and keeping their files, and making their decisions in the hot offices and the cool hill stations, in the bungalows and the government houses, in all the various places where the empire's administrative machinery was housed. Outside, the sun fell on the wide verandas. The flags moved slowly in whatever wind was available. The gardens, and there were always gardens. The British carried their gardening habits with them wherever they went, planting roses and lawns in unlikely climates with a persistence that was almost touching, were tended by gardeners who came every morning and went away every evening. Inside, the papers accumulated, the files thickened, the correspondence moved back and forth across the oceans on its slow, patient journeys, carrying the empire's administrative life in its envelopes, its careful copperplate handwriting, its columns of figures and its paragraphs of official prose. The empire in its administrative age was above all a thing made of words and numbers. It existed, in a very real sense, on paper, and the paper, in vast quantities, survives. There is a particular smell that lingers in the older parts of certain port cities, in the warehouse districts of Bristol and Liverpool, in the narrow streets behind the docks of London, in the counting houses and storage yards that survive, sometimes repurposed, sometimes simply persisting in the quiet way that old buildings do when no one quite gets around to demolishing them. It is a composite smell, layered and complex, made up of things that have been absorbed into the wood and stone over many generations. The sweetness of dried sugar, the dry, slightly dusty warmth of cotton bales, the darker, more complex notes of tobacco and spice, the mineral sharpness of tea stored in lead-lined chests. It is the smell of trade. It is the smell of the material empire. The empire not as a political or administrative arrangement, but as a vast, slow-moving circulation of goods, a system for bringing the products of distant soils and distant labor into the warehouses and the shops and the kitchens and the drawing rooms of Britain and the world. The material culture of the British Empire is worth dwelling on, because it is the aspect of the empire that touched the daily lives of ordinary people most directly and most persistently. The great majority of people who lived in Britain during the centuries of empire never served in the colonial administration, never commanded troops in a distant war, never sat in a governor's office deciding the fate of a province. But they drank tea. They wore cotton. They sweetened their food with sugar. They smoked tobacco or lived with people who did. They read by the light of lamps fueled with oil brought from distant seas. They sat on furniture polished with wax from colonial hives or decorated with inlaid wood from tropical forests. The empire came into their homes in the form of things, ordinary and domestic, and through those things it wove itself into the texture of everyday life so gradually and so thoroughly that it became, in time, invisible, simply the way things were, simply the ordinary furniture of a world that had always been arranged this way. Tea is perhaps the most emblematic of these commodities. The British relationship with tea is so well established, so deeply embedded in the culture, that it is easy to forget how recently it began and how far it traveled before it reached the cup. Tea had been known in China for thousands of years. The plant, Camellia sinensis, is native to the region where the borders of modern China, India, and Myanmar converge, and it has been cultivated and processed and consumed in East Asia since antiquity. It reached Europe through the Portuguese and Dutch trading networks in the early 17th century, and it arrived in England around the 1650s, initially sold in the coffee houses of London as a curiosity and a medicine, priced beyond the reach of ordinary people. The East India Company recognized its commercial potential early and began to import it in significant quantities from the late 17th century onward, and through the 18th century, the price fell as the volume increased and tea gradually descended through the social hierarchy until it was being consumed at every level of English society, from the elaborate tea ceremonies of the aristocracy to the working person's cup of strong, sweet brew taken with bread and cheese in the middle of the working day. For most of the 18th century, the tea that was drunk in Britain came from China, purchased at the great trading port of Canton, now Guangzhou, where the Qing dynasty permitted foreign merchants to operate within a strictly regulated framework that confined them to a small area of warehouses along the waterfront and required them to conduct all their business through a licensed guild of Chinese merchants called the Kohang. The East India Company's supercargoes, the commercial officers who managed the company's trade at Canton, spent the trading season in this confined world, negotiating prices and quantities with the Kohang merchants, managing the loading of their ships with the teas and silks and porcelain that the English market desired, and then sailing away each year as the trading season ended, and the authorities required all foreign merchants to withdraw. It was a regulated, patient, annual ritual of commerce, conducted within very specific boundaries, and it produced, year after year, the steady flow of tea that was becoming ever more essential to British life. The problem, from the company's perspective, was that the Chinese market had relatively little appetite for British goods. The Chinese imperial administration was self-sufficient in most things, and the manufactures of Britain, the woolens, the metalware, the clocks and scientific instruments that the company brought to Canton in search of exchange, found only a limited market. This meant that the company was paying for its tea largely in silver, draining bullion out of Britain in exchange for a commodity that the British consumed and did not produce. The trade deficit, patient and persistent, was a source of constant concern. The solution that the company eventually found to this problem was opium. Opium poppies were grown extensively in Bengal, under the careful supervision of the company's administration, and the drug produced from them was sold by the company at auction in Calcutta to private merchants, who then carried it to China and sold it illegally. The Qing government had banned the opium trade in exchange for silver, which they then used to purchase tea and other Chinese goods at Canton. The system was deliberately structured so that the company itself did not technically import opium into China, maintaining a legal distance from the trade while profiting from it indirectly through the auction sales in Calcutta. The opium trade grew through the late 18th and early 19th centuries until it was carrying millions of pounds of the drug into China annually, creating a large population of addicted users and draining silver out of China in a reversal of the earlier flow. The Qing government's attempts to suppress the trade led to the First and Second Opium Wars in 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860, in which British military force compelled China to accept the continuation of the trade, to open additional ports to foreign commerce, and to cede Hong Kong to British sovereignty. These were not episodes that reflected well on British commercial ethics, and they were noted as such by some observers at the time. But the appetite for tea and the commercial logic of the trade proved, as commercial logic often does, considerably more powerful than the ethical objections. The desire to reduce dependence on Chinese tea and the uncertainties created by the Opium Wars encouraged the company and later the British government to develop tea cultivation in India. The wild tea plant had been discovered growing in Assam in the 1820s, and experiments in cultivation had demonstrated that the Assam Hills and later the Darjeeling Highlands and the Nilgiri Hills in the south were well suited to tea production. The Indian tea industry developed rapidly in the second half of the 19th century, as large areas of forest were cleared and prepared for tea cultivation, and a system of labor recruitment was established that brought workers, largely from the tribal communities of central India, to the tea gardens on long-term contracts that bound them to the estates in conditions that were often barely distinguishable from indenture. The tea garden workers lived in lines of identical small houses built by the estate, received their wages partly in the form of food and goods from the estate shop, and were subject to legal penalties if they left their employment before their contracts expired. It was a system of considerable control, exercised quietly and systematically, with the weight of both colonial law and the physical isolation of the tea gardens pressing upon the workers from every side. By the end of the 19th century, Indian tea, much of it from Assam, which alone produced a very large share of the world's supply, had largely displaced Chinese tea in the British market, and the annual ritual of the tea harvest, the plucking and withering and rolling and drying and sorting of the leaf, was being repeated across thousands of acres of carefully tended hillside, producing the commodity that would eventually find its way into the cups of the British morning, in an act of consumption as unconscious and as habitual as breathing. Cotton tells a different story, and an even heavier one. Cotton had been produced and woven in India for thousands of years before the British arrived, and Indian cotton textiles, the muslins and calicoes and chintzes that were produced in the weaving towns of Bengal and the Coromandel coast, were among the finest and most highly valued fabrics in the world. The East India Company had traded in Indian textiles from its earliest years, and by the late 17th and early 18th centuries, Indian cotton cloth was flooding into the British market in enormous quantities, so popular with English consumers that the English wool and silk industries lobbied successfully for protective legislation. The Calico Acts of 1690 and 1720, restricting the import of Indian printed cotton cloth. The irony of this early chapter in the cotton story is that India, the country that would later be impoverished partly by the destruction of its textile industry, was at this stage so competitively superior in textile production that Britain needed to protect its own manufacturers from Indian competition. The Industrial Revolution changed everything. The mechanization of cotton spinning and weaving, which began in the north of England in the 1760s and 1770s, with the inventions of Hargreaves, Arkwright, and Crompton, and which was powered by the water, and then the steam that drove the great mills of Lancashire and Yorkshire, transformed the economics of cotton textile production. British mechanized mills could produce cotton cloth at a fraction of the cost of Indian handloom weavers, and through the first half of the 19th century, as the mills multiplied and the machinery improved, the cost fell further and further. The colonial administration, under pressure from British manufacturers, and operating within a free trade ideology that was, as critics noted at the time, distinctly convenient for the world's leading industrial power, removed the tariffs that had previously given Indian textiles some protection in the Indian market. British cotton cloth flooded into India, and the handloom weaving industry, which had supported millions of weavers and their families across the subcontinent, contracted slowly and then more rapidly, unable to compete with the machine-produced cloth that the mills of Lancashire were turning out at ever-decreasing prices. The human cost of this deindustrialization was quiet and enormous. It did not happen all at once. The decline of the Indian handloom weaving industry was a process that unfolded across decades, the demand for handloom cloth falling gradually as the price of mill cloth fell, the weavers finding their incomes reducing and their options narrowing, moving gradually into agricultural labor or other forms of work, as the weaving that had supported their families for generations became less and less viable. The names of the weavers are not in the records. The records that survive are the trade statistics, the tonnages of cotton cloth exported from Liverpool, the import figures for Indian ports, the mill production numbers from Lancashire, the aggregate numbers that tell the story in bulk, in total, without the individual faces and individual lives that the numbers contain within them. Lancashire itself was, in this period, a landscape of extraordinary industrial intensity. The mill towns Manchester, Oldham, Bolton, Preston, Blackburn, Burnley were dense with the sound and the smoke of cotton manufacturing, the air thick with cotton fibers that settled on every surface and, more damagingly, in the lungs of the mill workers, producing the chronic respiratory disease known as byssinosis. The cotton dust accumulating year by year in the tissue of the workers' lungs, as the cotton thread accumulated year by year on the bobbins of the spinning machines. The mills ran day and night, lit by gas and later electricity, the looms clattering in their long rows, tended by women and men and children. Child labor in the mills was widespread through the early industrial period, and the factory acts that gradually restricted and eventually prohibited it were the result of long campaigns by reformers who had to argue, patiently and repeatedly, against the economic interests of the mill owners and the doctrines of laissez-faire that provided those interests with their theoretical justification. The raw cotton that fed the Lancashire mills came, in the early decades of the Industrial Revolution, substantially from the American South, where the cotton plantations worked by enslaved people were producing enormous quantities of short-staple cotton that the newly invented cotton gin, Eli Whitney's device of 1793, could process at speed. The connection between the Lancashire mill and the American plantation was real and direct, and was understood at the time by those who cared to look at it. The thread that ran from the picking of cotton by an enslaved person in Georgia or Mississippi to the weaving of cloth in a Lancashire mill, to the purchasing of a cotton shirt by a customer in a London shop, was a thread with human suffering at one end of it and ordinary domestic comfort at the other. And the distance between those two ends was exactly long enough to make it easy not to follow it back to its source. Sugar, like cotton and tea, was a commodity with a weight of human suffering embedded in it. The sugar economy of the Caribbean, which had been built upon enslaved African labor through the 17th and 18th centuries, was the source of enormous wealth for the plantation owners, the merchants, the shippers, and the refiners who constituted the British sugar interest. The scale of the trade in enslaved people that sustained the plantation economy was immense. Between roughly 1650 and 1807, when the British slave trade was abolished, British ships carried somewhere in the region of 3 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic in the Middle Passage, the name given to the crossing from the West African coast to the Caribbean and the American mainland. The ships that made this crossing were crowded beyond any humane calculation. The people packed into the holds in conditions of extreme physical suffering, with mortality rates on individual voyages that could reach 30% or more in the worst years, though they declined somewhat as the trade became more regularized, and the economic incentive to deliver more of the cargo alive increased. The abolition of the British slave trade in 1807 and of slavery itself throughout the British Empire in 1833, coming into full effect in 1838, were the outcomes of one of the longest and most persistent campaigns of moral persuasion in British political history. The abolitionist movement, which had been building since the 1760s, and which brought together Quakers and evangelical Christians and political radicals, and formerly enslaved people who bore witness to their own experience, worked for decades through petitions and pamphlets and parliamentary speeches and boycotts of slave-produced sugar, pressing the argument that the trade and the institution were incompatible with Christian morality and with the principles of natural justice. The argument was true. It was also, as the abolitionists well understood, inconvenient for a very large number of people with a very direct financial interest in the continuation of the system. When emancipation finally came, the British government paid £20 million in compensation, a very large sum, roughly 40% of the annual government budget, to the owners of enslaved people. The enslaved people themselves received nothing, or rather they received a system of apprenticeship that required them to continue working for their former enslavers for a transitional period of several years, unpaid. The compensation records, which have been studied in recent years by researchers at University College London, reveal the breadth and depth of the financial interest in slavery within British society at the time of emancipation. The plantation owners, certainly, but also the bankers and lawyers and clergymen and politicians and aristocrats who held mortgages on plantations, or had inherited shares in them, or were connected to the slave economy through a dozen different financial threads. The wealth generated by the slave economy had spread, over 2 centuries, through the British economy in ways that are difficult to trace completely but impossible to ignore. The material empire was, in this sense, not simply a story of goods flowing into Britain, but a story of value being extracted from other places and other people, and concentrated in British hands. The mechanisms of extraction were various. the land revenue of India, which took a portion of the agricultural product of the subcontinent and converted it into funds available to the colonial administration. The terms of trade that favored British manufactured goods over colonial primary products. The preferential tariff arrangements that directed colonial trade toward Britain rather than toward potentially more advantageous markets elsewhere. The economist Utsa Patnaik, working with historical data in the 21st century, has estimated that the total drain of wealth from India to Britain over the period of colonial rule was of an order of magnitude difficult to fully comprehend. A slow, persistent, decades-long flow of value from a country that was, by some measures, the world's largest economy at the beginning of the 18th century, to the country that was building its industrial dominance on the foundations that colonial trade and colonial extraction helped to provide. This is not the whole story. The material empire also built things. The railways of India, which we have already touched on, were a real infrastructure, whatever their origins and their financing arrangements. The irrigation canals that were constructed across the Punjab and other agricultural regions of India in the 19th century brought water to millions of acres of previously dry land and supported large increases in agricultural production, though they also created new patterns of waterborne disease and disrupted existing ecological relationships in ways that took decades to understand. The telegraph cables that were laid along the ocean floors, connecting the empire's territories in a web of instantaneous communication, were a genuine technological achievement of considerable difficulty and considerable consequence. The empire built roads and bridges and harbors and courthouses and schools, and the things it built outlasted it in most places, becoming, after independence, part of the infrastructure of successor states. The weight of things is not simple. It is not a simple weight of suffering on one side and comfort on the other, though the suffering was real and the comfort was real. It is the weight of a system of such complexity and such temporal depth that it is difficult to hold all of it in mind at once. The plantation and the mill, the tea garden and the tea-room, the slave ship and the counting house, the irrigation canal and the land revenue assessment, all of it moving together in the vast, slow, unhurried circulation of goods and people and money and consequences that the empire sustained across 3 centuries and across the surface of the world. The smell in the old warehouse districts persists. The wood and the stone absorbed it over all those years and have not yet released it entirely. Stand quietly in one of those old streets in the early morning when no one else is about, and you can catch it still, the sweetness and the dust, the distant suggestion of spice, the faint, composite, unrepeatable smell of a trade that remade the world and left its traces, in the stone and in everything else, for much longer than anyone expected. The goods came in and went out and came in again for 300 years and more. The ledgers thickened. The warehouses filled and emptied and filled again. And the weight of it all, the true weight, beyond the tonnages and the sterling figures, settled into the history of the world like sediment into still water, slowly, patiently, and very deep. There is a particular quality of late afternoon light in the tropics that is unlike the light of any other time of day. It comes in low and golden, softened by the atmosphere's depth at that angle, and it falls on everything with a kind of unhurried generosity, on the white walls of government buildings, on the broad leaves of trees that have grown very large over many years, on the flags that hang motionless in the still air when the wind has died down in the hour before evening. It is a light that makes everything look beautiful and a little melancholy at the same time, the way that beautiful things often look when you are aware, even distantly, even without quite articulating it, that they are passing. It is the light of endings, or rather of the long, slow process of ending, not the sharp moment of conclusion, but the extended, gradual, gentle dissolution of something that has been present for a very long time, and is now, quietly and without drama, beginning to recede. The dissolution of the British Empire was such a process. It was not a single event or a single decision. It was a long fading, spread across decades, accomplished through hundreds of individual moments. The signing of documents, the lowering of flags, the departure of ships, the handing over of offices and keys and filing cabinets, each one small and local in its own time, each one adding a little to the accumulating reality of an empire that was becoming, territory by territory and year by year, something else. The process began, in its deepest roots, almost as soon as the empire reached its greatest extent. The forces that would eventually dissolve it were present and active long before the dissolution became visible to anyone who was not looking very carefully. The First World War, which began in the summer of 1914 and ended in November 1918, altered the empire in ways that were not immediately apparent but were, in retrospect, profound and lasting. The war was, among many other things, an imperial war. Soldiers from every corner of the empire, from India and Australia and Canada and New Zealand and South Africa, and the Caribbean and West Africa and East Africa, fought and died in the trenches of France and Flanders, in the desert campaigns of the Middle East, in the sea battles of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, in the campaigns against German colonial territories in Africa and the Pacific. More than 1 million Indian soldiers served in the British forces during the war. Australia and New Zealand together sent more than 400,000 men. Canada sent more than 600,000. The contribution of the empire's peoples to the British war effort was enormous, and it was not made without cost. The casualties sustained by colonial and Dominion troops at Gallipoli, on the Western Front in Mesopotamia, were large and deeply felt in the societies that had sent those men across the oceans. The men who returned from the war returned changed, and the societies they returned to were changed too. The experience of fighting alongside British soldiers, and sometimes of fighting with considerably more distinction than some of their British counterparts, had altered the relationship between the colonial soldier and the empire. Men who had served as officers, who had commanded troops, who had seen the great powers of Europe tear themselves apart in the most destructive war in history, found it more difficult, on their return, to accept the quiet condescensions of colonial life. The assumption that they were, by virtue of their race or their nationality, permanently junior to British-born men of equivalent or lesser ability. The exclusions from clubs and offices and social spaces that were maintained by custom, if not always by law. The war had made certain things visible that the ordinary routines of colonial life tended to obscure, and what was once visible was not easily made invisible again. In India, the political consequences of the war unfolded slowly, but with gathering momentum. The Indian National Congress, which had been founded in 1885 as a body intended to represent Indian educated opinion and to press, through constitutional means, for greater Indian participation in the governance of India, had been growing in confidence and in popular reach through the early years of the 20th century. Bal Gangadhar Tilak and Gopal Krishna Gokhale had defined, in different ways, the poles of Indian nationalist politics. Tilak's more assertive, culturally rooted nationalism and Gokhal's more gradualist, constitutional approach. And the tension between these tendencies would persist through the independence movement and beyond. But it was the arrival of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, returning to India from South Africa in 1915, after more than 2 decades of legal and political work on behalf of the Indian community there, that gave the independence movement its particular character and its extraordinary popular reach. Gandhi's approach to political action was unlike anything the British administration had previously encountered. His methods, satyagraha, the insistence on truth, expressed through nonviolent non-cooperation with the structures of colonial governance, were designed to make the empire's coercive apparatus visible in a way that it preferred not to be. When Gandhi called on Indians to refuse to buy British cloth, or to refuse to pay the salt tax, or to refuse to cooperate with the courts and the administration, he was not primarily trying to damage the empire economically, though the economic effects were real. He was trying to reveal the nature of colonial authority, to show that it rested, ultimately, on the willingness of the governed to be governed, and that when that willingness was withdrawn, quietly and persistently and without violence, the authority had nothing to stand on but force, and the use of force revealed its own moral bankruptcy. The Amritsar massacre of April 1919 was one of the moments when that moral bankruptcy became visible in its starkest form. Brigadier General Reginald Dyer ordered his troops to fire into a crowd of unarmed civilians who had gathered in the Jallianwala Bagh, an enclosed garden in Amritsar, for a public meeting. The firing continued for approximately 10 minutes until the ammunition was nearly exhausted. The official count of the dead was 379, though estimates by Indian sources placed the number considerably higher. Dyer later told a committee of inquiry that his purpose had been to produce a moral effect, to demonstrate, as he put it, that the empire would not tolerate disorder. The moral effect that was actually produced was rather different. The massacre became one of the central events in the Indian nationalist consciousness, a point of reference around which the argument for independence crystallized and hardened, a moment that Gandhi described as having made him understand that there could be no true partnership between India and the British Empire. The interwar years were years of slow, steady pressure. Gandhi's campaigns, the non-cooperation movement of 1920 to 1922, the Salt March of 1930, the Quit India movement of 1942, each one pressed the question of Indian self-governance more insistently. The British response was a mixture of repression and concession. The Government of India Acts of 1919 and 1935 extended Indian participation in provincial governance while retaining ultimate authority in British hands, a gradual devolution that was always a step or two behind what Indian nationalists were demanding, always offering less than what was being asked for, and always framing the offer as a generous concession rather than a recognition of a right. In Ireland, the process of dissolution had already reached its conclusion, or its partial conclusion, by the time these events were unfolding in India. Ireland had been connected to Britain by various forms of political union since the 12th century, and formally incorporated into the United Kingdom by the Acts of Union of 1800. The Irish independence movement, which had deep roots in the cultural and political life of the 19th century, came to its crisis in the Easter Rising of 1916, a rebellion in Dublin that was suppressed within a week, But that changed the political landscape of Ireland in the way that such events sometimes do, not through its immediate military success, but through the response it provoked. The execution of 15 of the rising's leaders by the British military authorities turned men who had been, before their deaths, controversial and divisive figures into martyrs, and martyrdom is a particular kind of political force, slow and transforming, working on the imagination over time. The Irish War of Independence of 1919 to 1921, followed by the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, resulted in the establishment of the Irish Free State, which would eventually become the Republic of Ireland. The partition of the island, with 6 counties of Ulster remaining within the United Kingdom as Northern Ireland, was a compromise that satisfied no one entirely and left a legacy of division that would persist, painfully, for generations. The Second World War, which began in September 1939 and ended in August 1945, accelerated the dissolution of the empire in ways that the First World War had begun but not completed. The war exposed the limits of British power in a way that was difficult to obscure. The fall of Singapore to Japanese forces in February 1942 was perhaps the most consequential single moment in this exposure. Singapore was, in the imperial imagination, a fortress, the great naval base at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, defended by batteries of heavy guns pointing seaward, the symbol and the guarantor of British power in Asia. The Japanese advance came overland from the north, through the Malay Peninsula, and the fortress that had been designed to repel a naval assault from the south found itself attacked from the direction for which it was least prepared. On the 15th of February 1942, General Arthur Percival surrendered his force of approximately 85,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops to a Japanese army that was considerably smaller. It was the largest surrender of British-led forces in history, and its effect on the prestige of the empire in Asia was immediate and lasting. The peoples of Asia, who had been governed by European colonial powers, watched the events of the early years of the Pacific War with a particular attention. The Japanese advance through Southeast Asia had swept aside the colonial administrations of the British, the Dutch, and the French with a speed that demonstrated, unmistakably, that those administrations had no special military invincibility, that they were not, as the colonial ideology had often implied, the natural and necessary rulers of Asia, but contingent powers that could be removed by force as they had been installed by force. Even though Japan was eventually defeated, and even though the British reoccupied their Asian territories in 1945, the world had shifted in ways that could not be reversed. The authority of the empire rested on a different footing after the war than it had before. The Atlantic Charter of 1941, signed by Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt as a statement of Allied war aims, included a declaration that the signatories respected the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they would live. Roosevelt, who had a consistent and unsentimental view of European colonialism as an arrangement that served European interests at the expense of colonial peoples, intended this declaration to apply universally. Churchill, who had said publicly that he had not become the king's first minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire, interpreted it more narrowly. The tension between these two interpretations, universal self-determination versus the preservation of the imperial order, would run through the post-war settlement and through the decade of decolonization that followed it. Britain after the war was exhausted and indebted. The war had been financed partly through the liquidation of overseas investments and partly through borrowing, particularly from the United States under the Lend-Lease arrangement, and the financial position of the country in 1945 was one of considerable weakness. The American loan of 1946, negotiated by John Maynard Keynes, came with conditions, among them the convertibility of sterling, that reflected the new realities of global economic power, the shift from a world in which Britain was the dominant financial center to a world in which that role had passed to the United States. The empire was expensive to maintain. The territories that had once seemed like assets, generating revenue and trade advantages, were increasingly appearing as liabilities, requiring military garrisons and administrative expenditures that a war-weakened Britain could ill afford. The independence of India and Pakistan in August 1947 was the pivotal moment of decolonization, not because it was the first, but because India was the largest and most central of the empire's territories, the jewel in the crown as it was sometimes called, the possession around which so much of the empire's self-image and strategic planning had been organized for 2 centuries. The process that led to independence was long and complicated and ultimately rushed. The final decision to partition the subcontinent into 2 states, one predominantly Hindu and one predominantly Muslim, was implemented on a timetable that proved far too compressed for the enormous human complexity of the division. The partition of India was accompanied by one of the largest and most violent forced migrations in history, as populations moved across the new borders between India and Pakistan, Muslims moving toward Pakistan, Hindus and Sikhs moving toward India, in conditions of communal violence that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. The exact number of deaths is not known and will never be known precisely. The violence unfolded across a vast landscape, in villages and on roads and in train carriages, quickly and chaotically, and the records are incomplete and contested. But the weight of it is not in doubt. The British departure from India was managed by Lord Mountbatten, the last viceroy, who arrived in March 1947 and oversaw the transfer of power in August of that year, a process that his predecessor had expected to take considerably longer, but which Mountbatten, reading the political situation with a certain pragmatic clarity, accelerated. The independence ceremony in Delhi on the 14th and 15th of August, the 14th for Pakistan, the 15th for India, was a formal and dignified occasion. The flags of the new nations raised as the Union flag was lowered, the speeches made, the salutes exchanged, the documents signed. Nehru's speech to the Indian Constituent Assembly on the night of independence, with its image of India's tryst with destiny, was received with deep emotion. It was a moment of genuine historical significance, felt as such by everyone present, and it was also, in the way of such moments, the formal marking of something that had in fact been happening for a very long time: the slow, gradual recession of British power from a subcontinent that had never truly belonged to it. The years that followed Indian independence saw the dissolution continue, territory by territory, across Africa and Asia and the Caribbean and the Pacific. Ceylon became independent in 1948, Burma in 1948. The Gold Coast, renamed Ghana, became the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence in 1957, under Kwame Nkrumah, who had been educated partly in Britain and whose political philosophy drew on both the African nationalist tradition and the Pan-Africanist ideas that had been developing in the African diaspora for decades. Nigeria in 1960, Sierra Leone in 1961, Tanganyika in 1961, later joining with Zanzibar to become Tanzania, Uganda in 1962, Kenya in 1963, Malawi and Zambia in 1964, and so on, through the 1960s and 1970s, the flags changing and the names changing, and the new governments taking their places in the institutions of their new states, inheriting the administrative buildings and the legal systems and the railway networks and the boundaries, those straight lines drawn on maps in distant offices that paid no attention to the human geographies they bisected, that the colonial period had left behind. The process was not always peaceful. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising of the 1950s, a rebellion centered primarily among the Kikuyu people, directed against white settler land ownership, and the structures of colonial rule, was suppressed by the British administration with considerable force, including the detention of large numbers of people in camps where conditions were, in many cases, extremely harsh. The details of what happened in these camps became more fully known only decades later, through the work of historians and journalists, and through legal proceedings brought by survivors. In Malaya, a communist insurgency that began in 1948 and lasted until 1960, the emergency, as the colonial authorities called it, was eventually suppressed through a combination of military operations and a program of social and political reform that addressed some of the underlying grievances of the rural Chinese community from which the insurgency drew much of its support. Cyprus saw a campaign for union with Greece, Enosis, that led to violence and eventually to independence in 1960, and later, to the partition of the island that persists to the present day. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was the moment at which the limits of British power in the post-war world were made most acutely and most publicly visible. Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal Company in July of that year. The canal had been built through Egyptian territory in the 1860s and remained under British and French control, and it was the route through which much of Britain's oil supply and a significant portion of its trade passed. Britain and France, in secret coordination with Israel, launched a military operation to retake the canal in October 1956. The operation was militarily successful in its immediate objectives, but it was brought to a halt not by Egyptian resistance but by American pressure. The United States, under President Eisenhower, refused to support the operation and used its financial leverage to force a British withdrawal. The episode demonstrated, with a clarity that was painful for many in Britain, that British military action in the world was no longer something that could be undertaken without American approval, and that the era in which Britain could project its power globally on its own terms had passed. Harold Macmillan, speaking to the South African Parliament in Cape Town in February 1960, used the phrase "the wind of change" to describe the force of African nationalism sweeping across the continent. A recognition, from a conservative prime minister who had himself served the empire, that the political world had altered in ways that could not be resisted and should not be resisted, that the age of European colonial rule in Africa was ending, and that it was better to manage that ending gracefully than to delay it through force. The speech was not universally welcomed. The South African government, committed to the system of apartheid that would persist for another 3 decades, received it with visible displeasure. but it reflected a genuine shift in British policy thinking, a willingness to accelerate the process of decolonization rather than to maintain empire by the kind of sustained violence that the French were simultaneously attempting in Algeria. The Commonwealth, which had been evolving since the Statute of Westminster of 1931, gave full legislative autonomy to the dominions, became the institutional framework through which the empire's former territories maintained a connection to one another and to Britain after independence. It was a loose arrangement, a family of nations, in the phrase that was sometimes used, implying the voluntary nature of the association and the equality of its members, though the family metaphor carried its own complications, given the actual history of the relationships involved. The Commonwealth provided a set of forums, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, various functional organizations dealing with trade and health and education and law, through which former colonial territories could cooperate with one another and with Britain on matters of common interest, while remaining fully sovereign in their own affairs. It was not the empire. It was something quieter and less defined, a residue, perhaps, or a transformation, the empire having changed its form without entirely disappearing, like a substance that passes from one state to another and is still, in some sense, recognizably itself. Hong Kong, which had been ceded to Britain after the First Opium War, and had grown over a century and a half into one of the world's great trading and financial centers, was returned to China in 1997 under the terms of a handover agreement negotiated between the British and Chinese governments. The ceremony of handover, held in the early hours of the 1st of July, was watched by a very large global television audience. The rain fell steadily throughout the evening, and the Union flag was lowered, and the flag of the People's Republic of China was raised, and Prince Charles and the last governor, Chris Patten, sailed away on the royal yacht Britannia through the dark harbor. It was the last significant territorial handover of the empire, and it had the quality that endings have when they have been long anticipated and carefully prepared, a quality of solemnity mixed with something approaching relief, the relief of something long uncertain becoming, at last, resolved. What the empire left behind is a question that does not have a simple answer, and is probably not best answered simply. It left behind the boundaries of states, those straight lines on maps that continue to shape the political geography of Africa and Asia and the Middle East in ways that are not always comfortable or stable. It left behind legal systems, based on English common law, that operate in dozens of countries and that have been adapted and modified, and made the property of the societies that use them. It left behind languages. English, spread by colonial education across the world, has become the closest thing the present world has to a global lingua franca, a development with consequences so large and so various that they are still being worked out. It left behind railways and buildings and irrigation systems and universities and cricket, that most English of games, which took root in the Caribbean and in India and in Australia and in South Africa and in many other places, and became, in each of those places, something distinctly its own, a game that carries the traces of its origins while belonging now to the world. It left behind, also, something harder to name, a set of relationships, of migrations, of diasporas, of cultural entanglements that continue to make themselves felt in the present. The people who came from the Caribbean and from South Asia and from East Africa to Britain in the decades after the Second World War, responding to the labor shortages of the post-war economy, moving, as citizens of the Commonwealth, to a country that had been, for generations, called the mother country in the imperial education they had received, brought with them their languages and their foods and their music and their ways of being in the world, and in doing so they changed Britain, slowly and persistently, in the way that all migrations change the places that receive them. The Britain of the 21st century is a country shaped, in ways that are visible in every large city, by the history of the empire, by the movements of people that the empire set in motion and that have continued in changed forms, long after the empire itself has ended. The late afternoon light fades eventually into evening. The golden warmth cools and dims, and the shadows lengthen across the white walls and the broad leaves and the still flags, and the day moves, gently and without haste, toward its close. The buildings remain, the government offices and the railway stations, and the courthouses and the bungalows, standing in their various states of use and disuse and transformation, housing new functions, new occupants, new purposes, while retaining in their walls and their proportions the faint architectural memory of what they were built for and by whom and when. The files remain too, in archives in London and Delhi and Nairobi and Kingston and Canberra, the patient paper record of the empire's administrative life, waiting for the historians and the researchers who come to read them, one folder at a time, in the quiet of the reading room, in the particular quality of silence that old documents produce around themselves. The ships have mostly stopped running their old routes. The trade flows have changed, redirected by new economic arrangements and new political realities. The flags that fly over the former colonial capitals are not the Union flag. The names on the maps are not, in most cases, the names the empire gave them. The world has rearranged itself, as it always does, according to the pressures and the possibilities of its own present moment, carrying forward what it cannot yet put down and releasing slowly what it no longer needs. The British Empire lasted, in its various forms, for more than 300 years. At its greatest extent, in the years after the First World War, it covered roughly a quarter of the land surface of the Earth and encompassed something like a quarter of the world's population. It was the largest empire in history, in terms of territorial extent, and its reach touched virtually every part of the world and virtually every aspect of the modern world's organization. Its economies, its legal systems, its languages, its borders, its migrations, its sports, its teas. It was built slowly, over generations, by people who were, for the most part, not thinking about building an empire but about making a living, doing their jobs, pursuing the commercial and administrative and military opportunities that the world offered them. And it faded slowly, over generations in the same way, not in a single dramatic dissolution, but in a long, gradual recession, a tide going out, leaving behind, as tides do, a altered landscape in which the evidence of where the water has been is everywhere, if you know how to read it. The evening comes on, soft and unhurried. The last of the light lingers on the horizon for a long time, longer than you expect, touching the edges of things with gold before it finally, gently, lets them go. The stars appear, one by one in the darkening sky. And the world, which has been remade so many times and which will be remade again, turns slowly beneath them, as it has always turned, patient and vast and ancient, carrying its histories lightly, the way the deep ocean carries everything in its depths, below the reach of the wind, in the still and unhurried dark.